Hello and welcome back to our pre-concert talks for our second Masterworks of the season. I'm Ed Parsons, General Manager of the Florida Orchestra. Always a pleasure to have with us our principal guest conductor, Stuart Malina. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we're recording this before we've actually even started rehearsing, but we are very excited for this week's program. It's been a while since we've seen you, or anyone, really.
It's been since February, so it's been a little under 9 months since I've been down here in St. Petersburg.
And how has your last 9 months been?
I think like most other people. Actually, I have to say I feel luckier than most. I mean, my family hasn't been touched by the disease. The kids are well, I'm well. Both my orchestras are getting through this, struggling through it, but getting through it. And I feel very lucky.
And you've had a couple chances to get out the old cobwebs in Harrisburg, right?
This will be my fourth concert since the pandemic started. So we've done 3 recordings that we've streamed in Harrisburg already.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us as always. And we have a wonderful program for you this weekend. It's all Mozart. And we start with Mozart's Concerto for Flute and Harp. Mozart wrote this concerto in 1778 while living in Paris. He was 22 years old and still struggling to make a living as a composer. One of his side jobs was tutoring the daughter of a local duke in Paris. And the duke played the flute and his daughter played the harp. So the duke commissioned him to write this concerto for them to play. And he likely wrote it with their abilities in mind. Mozart remarked in a letter to his father that the Duke played the flute extremely well, and the daughter's harp playing was magnifique, though as a composition student, she was thoroughly inept. Unfortunately, Mozart came to despise this Duke, since he never actually paid Mozart for this exceptional work. We think of the combination of flute and harp as very common today. But really, this didn't come into fashion until the late 19th century and into the 20th century, especially with French music. This was perhaps the first ever combination of these two instruments, and it was fairly typical of Mozart to use unusual instruments, though it's perhaps telling that he left a sour taste in his mouth after this commission not being paid for, because it is the one and only piece he ever wrote for the harp.
Yeah, it's interesting that he chose harp, but what's equally interesting is that the writing for the harp really is piano writing. If you read the score and look at the music, you're not struck by, this is harp music. Rather, it looks like a piano accompaniment to a flute and piano concerto, or much of the time, a flute and piano sonata. And needless to say, Mozart wrote many sonatas, particularly for violin and piano. And so he understood how to pair those two instruments, but I don't know that he knew all that much about how to write for harp, and I think harp players would probably bear that up if you asked them.
Right, well, it was a very new instrument at the time and almost never used in orchestra, and the harp that we know today didn't really come into existence until 1810. And because it's written as sort of a piano piece that's played on the harp, it is extraordinarily difficult for harpists, and it is maybe the #1 audition piece when you're listening to a harp player. And this comes because in traditional harp technique, the pinky is not used very much. But in this, because in the piano, especially in the left hand, you use the pinky all the time. And so the harpist has to use their pinky constantly when playing this.
Yeah, if you think about classical music in so many ways is based on what we call the Alberti bass, which is da ya da da ya da 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 ya, like the very famous C major piano sonata. And so Mozart naturally used this Alberti bass for much of this piece, not knowing that on the harp it's an extremely awkward figure to play. And so, yeah, harpists have struggled with this piece, and luckily we've got a magnificent harpist playing it in this orchestra.
Indeed, and I should say that our soloists for this concerto are our principal flute player, Clay Ellerbroek, and the harpist will be our principal harp player, Anna Kate Mackle. And the first movement is sort of typical of concertos of this time. Two beautiful themes in a spirited allegro C major.
Yep, and it opens in C major cum C major with a C major chord followed by a C major arpeggio followed by some C major scales, and so you are basically battered over the head in a very delightful way with C major. But yes, it's a very typical concerto movement. So you start with a big orchestral exposition, which lays out both the opening theme and the second theme. Just with orchestra, and then the solo instruments come in and basically repeat both of those themes again as it progresses through a normal sonata form.
And the second movement is definitely the most famous. It has these beautiful soaring melodies in the flute, tenderly accompanied by the harp.
It really does, and there are two things that I want to point out about the second movement. One is, yes, the soaring melodies, and he uses melodies in counterpoint with each other and uses what we call suspensions, which are dissonances that resolve into consonances. And when you combine the beautiful melodies with these dissonances that are resolving, it's achingly beautiful. The other thing that I'll mention about this movement is that he uses dynamics, the louds and soft, extremely skillfully. Nothing far out, but it'll have these enormous builds, and then they'll suddenly get soft as the phrases resolve. It's a wonderful movement, very simple and absolutely beautiful.
And the third movement in typical classical concerto style is a jaunty rondo.
That's right. And a rondo is basically a theme. You start with a theme, and the theme comes back after different episodes interrupted. And so if you think of rondo as as an Italian form of round, you have the theme, and then you have a different theme. And it takes you back to the theme, and then it takes you to a different theme. And basically you have this circle that keeps returning to the opening melody.
And for our other work on this program is Mozart's Symphony No. 40. Mozart's last three symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41, were written in a remarkable 2-week period near the end of his life in 1788, and sort of the culmination of his musical genius. Of these three, No. 40 is perhaps the most influential in history. Wagner called it pivotal to the Romantic world, and it really did sort of usher into the Romantic period what drama could be in music.
It's such an extraordinary piece of music. On the one hand, it is a classical symphony. He doesn't discard any of the classical conventions. The relationships of the keys in terms of sonata form are very standard. But on the other hand, even just when you look at the very beginning of the very first movement, you know this melody. I mean, when we were in conservatory, we would sing, "It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart," and it's this haunting melody. But what's interesting is not so much the melody itself, but the fact that there's no introduction at all. Most of Mozart's symphonies begin with grand, majestic adagios, slow sections that then will release into an allegro section. And the few times that he doesn't have these, for example, the Hafner Symphony, number 35, he'll start with still a very dramatic statement of, in that case, D major. In this case, you start with basically a murmuring, very agitated accompaniment figure just in the low strings. And then on top of that, the melody emerges in the upper strings. The only piece that I can really think of that's similar to that, of even remotely this period, even though it's considerably later in history, is Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, which begins with the same kind of murmuring before the violin solo comes in, with no other introduction. But at the time, this must have been somewhat jarring to have a piece that began like this. It immediately sucks you into this very dark, mysterious world. And when we talk about the romantic elements of this piece, again, we're talking about romantic not in terms of the way we would use it between lovers. It's not about love. Romantic was the period in history where emotions became the ruler of art. And so in this piece, you have definite emotional content particularly in the first, second, and fourth movements. At the very beginning, it's stormy, it's agitated. The second movement is serene, but at the same time, lurking under the surface, there's this agitation and uncomfortableness. And the last movement is just an explosion of energy. It's a phenomenal work and rather extraordinary that it was written when it was written.
Yeah, and perhaps one of the most personal to Mozart. Mozart's life was not an easy one, as we know, filled with financial hardship and strife. And when it was written, it was a particularly difficult period in his life. He was not performing publicly. His popularity was waning. He had no income to speak of. His daughter had just died. His wife was in very poor health. And just a very dark, dark time. And he would only not even live another year after this. And it's one of only 2 symphonies in his life that he wrote in a minor key. And we feel the suffering and the terror and grief, but also sensuality and hope intermixed. And they often play off of each other to make this really rounded vision of sort of human life.
In a sense, if you think about what was going on in Mozart's life at the time, it's more extraordinary that he wrote the 39th Symphony and the 41st Symphony at the same time. This is the one that I think truly reflects what was going on in his mind, in his heart, in his soul, and yeah, it's hard to imagine the hardship in his life, the heartbreak of the loss of family, all of these things. But you hear this all come to bear, and yes, there are rays of light that emerge in each of the movements, and yet somehow he always manages to return to this very stormy, agitated state.
Yeah, and even the third movement, which is a typical minuet, would be in any classical symphony, which is usually, even in something that has a lot of drama in it, the minuet would be a reprieve. It would be a sunny moment to just say, okay, let's take a break from all this, complex music and just have a little dance. But even here, it's dark.
Well, and you do have a trio that's extremely sunny.
Right.
But it doesn't last very long.
Right. And it's really the only moment of true sunlight that comes
That
in.
is true. And the first part of this minuet, a minuet is a dance. It's a stately court dance. One cannot even begin to imagine dancing to this minuet. This is a minuet of tremendous angst and energy.
Right. And the finale shows off Mozart's explosive personality, often even becoming violent at times. And ends in a minor key, which is really revolutionary. Even in classical period, symphony might be in a minor key, but they always end in major, because you just can't end something in a sad way. You got to end it in a happy way. But here, he takes that minor and really commits and goes all the way to the end with it.
He really does. And the other thing that he does is in both the first movement and the last movement, when he's coming towards the ends of the movements, instead of just going through like a normal recapitulation would be, where you would have the closing statement like it was presented in the exposition, here he takes you a little bit on a side route, which just increases that drama and energy. And what can I say? Mozart knew how to write dramatic music. His best music, many people say, was music for opera. And in these 3 symphonies, you have perhaps his most operatic approaches to writing symphonic music. It's an amazing achievement.
It's going to be a wonderful program, perfect for our socially distanced orchestra. And we hope that you will be able to join us this weekend, November 14th and 15th at the Mahaffey Theater. And if you cannot join us at the Mahaffey Theater, at 8 o'clock on Saturday the 14th, we will be live streaming it through our website, and we hope you can join us for that.
Please do. This is going to be a concert not to be missed.
Thank you so much, Stuart.
Thank you, Ed.